Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am again here today at the IRCGN reference collection. This is the Central Firearms Reference Collection of the French Gendarmerie, and they have very generously allowed me to come in and pull out a couple of interesting guns to film for you guys. So what we have today is a really cool example of one of sort of the lost links in the development of what would start as the Sturmgewehr 44, more or less, and end up being the H&K roller-locked or roller-delayed system that everyone's very familiar with today. Now, this development process went through essentially 4 different countries. It started in Germany during World War II. There were some engineers at Mauser, in particular a guy named Vorgrimler, who came up with essentially what they called the half-locked system, which we would call a roller-delayed. And they did some development in Germany, and they were on their way to developing what was going to be the Sturmgewehr 45, a roller-delayed select-fire carbine in 8mm Kurz caliber that never actually got completed. So I have some videos on the 45. There were 20 parts kits for the guns that were partially completed by the end of the war. Video on the Mauser train taking them to where they would. It was hoped that they would be, reset up manufacturing this hidden facility deep in the mountain caves. Never actually worked out that way. Instead, what happened was that the Mauser facility in Oberndorf came under French control at the end of World War II. It was in the French zone of occupation, and the French were very happy to have Mauser continue doing a bunch of work. So the Mauser factory continued to make things like 22 caliber rifles. The French would adopt the MAS 45, which was essentially a repurposed Mauser 340 training rifle. Got a video on that as well. And the Mauser R&D department was also kept running. It was given over to a program called DIFA, Direction d'études de fabrication d'armement, study of weapons fabrication. And this took place in Oberndorf for about 2 years. In 1947, they decided to move the facility, the R&D facility, to France, to a place called Mulhouse. And by 1948, this move had been completed, and they formed what was called CEAM, the Centre d'études et d'armement Mulhouse, the Center for Studies and Armaments of Mulhouse. And with this facility came primarily two German engineers from Mauser, Vorgrimler and Loeffler. And these guys would both be put to work developing small arms systems. Now, at this period, the French had decided that they were interested in a weapon very much like the Sturmgewehr, like an intermediate caliber shoulder rifle. And so they put in place development programs for 2 different versions. One was specifically going to be a semi-automatic only intermediate caliber carbine, essentially something that could fill the role of the US M1 carbine. And they also were investigating a select fire version, something that would be essentially like the German Sturmgewehr. And this wasn't done just by their German engineers in Mulhouse. This was also a project that was undertaken by the 3 operating French state arsenals, Tulle, Châtellerault, and Saint-Étienne, or MAC, MAS, and MAT. All 4 of these facilities would come up with a series of prototypes, and for a couple of years in the late 1940s, 47, 48, 49, 50, these development programs were underway. And they came up with a whole slew of different prototypes. And we'll take a look at some others at a later date. What we have here is essentially the final version from CEAM, from Mulhouse, done by these ex-Mauser German engineers. Now, the French state arsenals had a variety of different mechanisms that they were experimenting with. The German engineers were all going with this roller-delayed system that they had developed at Mauser. And it's interesting that there were 2 main German engineers at Mulhouse, and they both worked with their own teams competitively with each other. And to a certain extent, elements of both of their designs were incorporated into the final Mulhouse project rifle, which is essentially this. However, it was really much more Loeffler's gun that was accepted than Vorgrimler's. And so, as this project goes on, Vorgrimler kind of gets dissatisfied, disillusioned, like he's not happy working for the French. And by the way, the German engineers were working voluntarily for the French. They didn't have to, they were employed. Anyway, at the end of this project, Vorgrimler's kind of disillusioned with the whole thing. He's not happy that none of his work is actually being used, as it's much more Loeffler's design that has been accepted and moved forward by the French. And so in June 1950, Vorgrimler has had enough, and he quits and goes to work for the Spanish instead at CEAM. And that, of course, is where the developmental story of what would become HK continues, because it was the rifle that Vorgrimler developed at CEAM that would eventually be adopted by the German Bundeswehr and become the G3. What we have here is sort of a sidetrack of that developmental story. So this rifle is in .30 carbine. Prior to 1948, the French were open to a variety of different calibers, and in fact, the German engineers came up with a cartridge that was designated 7.65 Mass, or 765 by 35 millimeter, that essentially duplicated the 8mm Kurz effect, the general handling and ballistics of 8mm Kurz. It was a 93 grain bullet fired at 2,300 feet per second, so a little lower mass than Kurz, but that was the initial idea. They then started looking more seriously at .30 carbine. In 1948, the French decided to officially adopt .30 carbine as a standard cartridge, largely because of the number of US M1 carbines that they have in inventory, and which they like quite a lot. And so at that point, these Mulhouse guns pivot from 7.65 by 35 to now .30 carbine caliber, and that's what we have here. All of the development would ultimately lead to this, the model of 1950. There were 6 of these guns made. Some of them have charging handles on the left. That's the 50B, which we have here. Some of them had a charging handle on the right. And there are, like, every one of the developmental iterations leading up to this would have different characteristics. Some had fixed stock, some had folding stock, some had wire stocks, some had bipods, some didn't. Some were set up for rifle grenades, some weren't. There is a bit more detail in that than we can get into today. But anyway, I have rambled on enough about the origins of this. Let's take a look at the inside of it, because this is fantastic. It's like a little 3/4, 80% scale G3 chambered for .30 carbine. Seriously, this thing is just fantastic. Handles great. It is light. In .30 carbine, I have to imagine that this would be magnificent to shoot. Unfortunately, we don't have a chance to shoot this one, but we can pull it apart and take a closer look at it. First off, our markings. This is the Carbine mitrailleuse, which means automatic carbine, caliber 7.62, which in this case is going to refer to .30 carbine, which is 7.62 millimeter. CEAM, that is the Mulhouse Design Bureau. This is type 1950B. I mentioned the B indicates that it has a charging handle on the left side, serial number 5. And then they have also marked it model 50/5, the /5 being the serial number 5. We have a 3-position selector here, M for mécanique, which is automatic, S for sûreté, sûr, which is safe, and C for coupe par coupe, semi-automatic. And you can see here a transition from the German selector systems to what would eventually become HK. Well, the World War II German selector systems to what would become HK. And we can see much of the stylistic design that would go on to actually be used at CEAM. This trigger housing was essentially Vorgrimler's idea that got latched onto some of the other design elements that came from Loeffler. If I zoom out a little bit here, you can see the basic construction here, where we have a stamped receiver up on top. We have a fire control unit in the pistol grip that is pinned in the front and that are riveted in the front, and then held in place with the stock end cap here with these 2 pins. So you pull those pins, the buttstock comes off, the grip pivots down, the bolt comes out, and that is your disassembly. It's very simple. There were a number of different types of magazine that were developed and used. I believe this is a 20-rounder. They did also make 30s and 40s. You can see the follower actually looks quite a bit like an M1 carbine. Slight curve to it. Recall that on the M2 carbine magazines used by the US, once you got past 15 rounds, they just realized that you do need a little bit of curvature to properly feed. Beyond that, this is a very sturdy magazine, and you can see the obvious similarities to construction of later G3 style magazines, the reinforcing up here and the magazine stops. Bipods were a popular option, actually even into Spanish and German use of the G3 and the various SETME patterns. The idea of having an integral bipod that doubled as a handguard was a very popular one. So in this, we have a little sheet metal tab here that acts as a lock, and the bipod legs can open up just like so. There is some pivot to the gun. In fact, it can pivot all the way over. There are no locks on the bipod legs, so part of the reason that they fold a bit farther forward is so that the gun can actually rest securely on the bipod. To bring it back, you just fold this back and snap the two pieces in place. There's the little spring sheet metal tab that holds the bipod leg in place. You can see that the receiver here is stamped just like an HK type of receiver, just like a Sturmgewehr 45 receiver. This would have been a single flat that was then folded over and seam welded down through there. And they've done a very good job of it, but you can see where the seam originally was right there. Inside that, of course, is a front trunnion, and you can see right there the back edge of the trunnion itself. The trunnion is going to hold the barrel in place and have the locking recesses for the rollers. Up on top of the barrel, we have what looks like a gas tube, but is not. This is an element of this system that was pioneered at this point at Mühlhaus. The German-designed guns did not have charging handles up forward here. They didn't have this tube above the barrel, but of course the SETMEs and the G3s do. This is where it originated in the Mühlhaus development. So this is a charging handle with just a simple inert tube here that pushes back on our bolt carrier. So let's go ahead, actually let's look at the sights and then we'll go ahead and pull it apart. Being designed for .30 carbine, this doesn't need a whole lot of range. It has a simple 2-position rear aperture sight, and the front sight is just a barleycorn style post there with a couple protective wings, and it can be threaded in and out to adjust for elevation. Lastly, I should point out that this has a folding stock. So we've got a big locking latch right there and a hinge, and that folds to the side. There is nothing that locks it open. It just stays there. This is more of a transportation sort of thing. The clip to actually hold the stock closed is in fact this guy. So this big old spring clip, when you fold this around, is going to lock on the opposite side of the receiver, just like that. Kind of a funky system, but I suppose that works as well as anything. And to open it up, you just, now you do have to manually latch this. You can't just slam it. But it's nice sturdy lockup when it's locked, and you know, that system works. All right, now for disassembly, we're going to pull out these 2 pins. That bottom one is easy. This top one is more stiff. There we go. And then this stock assembly will come off. There we go. And we have the recoil spring and its guide rod, which are fixed in place on the stock, the rear end cap there. With the buttstock off, we can then pull our charging handle back and drop out what looks very, very much like a G3 bolt and carrier. And we can also pivot down the fire control group. So HK, SETME and HK, would take this fire control group essentially and simplify it, modularize it to the point that it was in a self-contained housing that would then slide into the trigger assembly, the fire control assembly. At this point in its development, these pieces are all held in place separately. They don't come out as a unit. So this is hammer fired, by the way. There's our hammer there. We've got disconnector in here as well. All of those sorts of fire control elements in there. Ultimately, just a very simple stamped sheet metal receiver that holds everything together. You can see the profile at the back here. These two stampings are essentially rails that hold the bolt carrier in place. So I'm not going to go into a detailed description of the roller delayed system here. We'll go ahead and take this apart. But what I do want to point out is on the G3, there is a locking lever which prevents bolt bounce. So bolt bounce is a problem that the German designers were having at this point in the development of the guns. The issue is when the gun's unlocked like this, the bolt closes and it's going to, the bolt head is going to retract back here into the bolt body, and as it does, these rollers are forced out into the trunnion, and that's what holds the gun closed. Well, the issue is when this is coming forward, moving very fast under spring pressure, it's going to tend to close, and as soon as the bolt head contacts the back of the bolt body there, it bounces, and you'll get just a little bit of opening like that. Well, in full auto fire, if this bounces open at just the right moment, you can either cause the hammer to not be able to follow through and hit the firing pin and cause a malfunction, or worse, you can have it actually fire when it's just slightly starting to unlock, and that can cause the bolt to open way too fast. It sort of bypasses the mechanical locking system. And this was continuing to be a problem. So at this stage in development, what they did to try to counter it was to put a moving counterweight in the back of the bolt, and that's right here. And so the idea is when the bolt is closing, that weight is sitting back like this, and just as the bolt tries to bounce open, that weight moves forward when the bolt hits. And the weight moving forward here and the bolt head trying to bounce open, those two forces counteract each other and prevent there from being a problem. That turns out to not be the best system. You still see some of this today. There were issues that the M16 had with bolt bounce that were, well, in fact, if you look in the Stoner in particular, the Stoner has mobile tungsten weights in its bolt carrier that do essentially the exact same thing as this weight, and for the same reason, to prevent bolt bounce from causing problems. Here, this was a stepping stone until they were able to later develop the locking lever instead that forces the bolt to stay in the locked position until firing. Beyond that, this looks very much like a standard, what would later be an HK bolt. So this is just a punch that I'm using. We have one cross pin there. If I pull that out, I then have my firing pin. I can pull out my counterweight right there. Note that it's got this, it and the firing pin both have these cross cuts, and those are for the pin there. And then I can take my locking, my bolt head here, I can pull that off, and this really doesn't want to come out. So I'm going to leave it in because I don't, oh, wait, no, there we go. Okay. And there is our locking wedge. So the angle of these two surfaces is critical for the proper timing and operation of the gun. And in this case, that is set up for 30 carbine. And you can see this is clearly hand finished. Every one of these Model 1950 guns is a hand-built gun because there were only half a dozen of them. So there's your bolt head with its rollers and the bolt carrier, which looks just like the system that would go on to be used for HK and CETME, just with the exception of this counterweight cut in there. And there is the whole thing, the CEAM, the Mulaus Model 1950B Carbine mitrailleuse in 30 carbine caliber. So I already told you that Vorgrimler got dissatisfied working for the French government and moved to Spain, and it is from there that we get the H&K G3 and related guns. Loeffler was happier working at Mulhouse. Of course, his gun went farther in French development, and so even after this program got canceled, which was, by the way, 1952, the French, after doing all of this work, they kind of then go, well, I think we'll just stick with a rifle caliber instead. We'll stick with a 7.5. At that point, they're actually starting to look at 7.62 NATO as well. That's a subject for a whole different series of videos. But their intermediate caliber carbine assault rifle system program gets canceled in 1952. Well, Loeffler stays on at Mulhouse, and he pivots to doing full-size rifle caliber work. He puts together an interesting bullpup design that is roller delayed. That then leads to tilting bolt bullpups, and he's there until at least 1956. It's a little unclear to me exactly what happens to Loeffler eventually. Eventually he retires and leaves the business, but he appears to have stayed at Mulhouse at least until 1956, doing other weapons development work, none of which would end up actually getting adopted. This is a period where there was a ton of experimentation that led to very little actually getting adopted. So anyway, a big thank you to the Gendarmerie, to the IRCGN collection, the ballistics lab here, for giving me the opportunity to pull out this and show it to you guys. These are obviously extremely rare today. They only made 6 of them in the first place, and I have not seen any of these guns, this intermediate Mulhouse development outside of France. So a big thanks to them. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.